Hello, everyone. Welcome to our April rendition of our ongoing webinar series. Just everyone's getting into right now from our waiting room. So we'll just give it a couple minutes to let everyone get in, and then we will get started. We are joined today by silver folks, but we have inspectors and managers of various inspection groups in Minneapolis and St. Paul who will be sharing some of their expertise with us today. So again, give us just a minute or so to let folks come in, and then we'll get started. So thank you. Okay, looks like we are slowing down on folks coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and start kicking us off. I do have a couple of housekeeping slides that we can get through quick. So again, welcome everybody to our April webinar. This is part of an ongoing series that we at Homeland have been doing for, well, gosh, since about March of 2020 in various formats. Started with pandemic stuff as things were constantly changing through that. And now we have kind of solidified into a once-a-month webinar where we cover various topics that intersect with tenant landlord law here in Minnesota. We are going to be joined today by a couple of guest speakers. We have Enrique Velasquez from the Inspection Service Division Director at the City of Minneapolis, as well as Brian Starry, who's the Field Operations Manager in the City of Minneapolis. And then we have AG Nice. I'm sorry, I should have asked how to pronounce that before I brought us all on. So I apologize if I got that messed up here. But he's with the Department of Safety and Inspections. He's a fire safety manager over in the city of St. Paul. We'll also be joined by a housing attorney here at Homeline, Samuel Spade, who will help answer any questions that come through that aren't specifically related to our inspector folks here. So that brings me to my next slide. So if you are new here, we have Homeline is a nonprofit. We serve tenants across the entire state of Minnesota. So far, we actually just hit our 300,000 mark of households served. So we've been open since 1982. So in 31 years, we've done over 300,000 calls, emails, and such. So really big milestone that we just hit. Our services are free and we do offer them in 4 languages: English, Somali, Hmong, and Spanish. This is our hotline information. These are the various language lines. And we also offer email as an alternative contact method as well. Housekeeping then. So this session is being recorded. So it's going to be available on our website, homelinemn.org, in a couple of days. Again, we'll have to upload it to the cloud and get everything sorted through that, but then it will be posted. We are not applying for CLE credits for this particular webinar. Some of our webinars do get CLE credits. This particular one will not. And then we highly encourage questions. We get lots of questions throughout. Really like it when we get questions, but I ask you please, 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 please to put the questions in the Q&A function that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you try and put them through anywhere else, I will almost certainly miss them and then I will feel badly. So please utilize the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. We did also get some pre-submitted questions that folks gave when they registered that we will also be going through, but the best way to get your questions seen and addressed is to go through that Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. So I just wanted to hit on a couple of things as well real quick, just as a very general couple things to note. We have folks here from the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul, but those are obviously not the only places that have city inspectors, but not every city in Minnesota has an inspections department. So if you are from a city that may or may not have it, and you don't know, it's best to just contact your city to find out. Even if they have an inspections department, not every department does rental inspections. So again, some of your mileage may vary about what's going here in today's presentations. And every city has their own codes and ordinances. So what may be applicable in one city isn't going to be necessarily applicable to the next city. So best if you've got questions, you're a renter, a landlord, or a service provider in and you're not sure about what your city codes are or what your process is, contact your city. They're usually more than happy to help. You can find their phone numbers or go through their websites usually. And if you need to contact an inspector for whatever reason, I've included the links for Minneapolis and St. Paul, since that's who we have here today. But if you're in another city, you can give them a call, look at their website, or Homeline a couple of years ago put together a chart of heat codes, specifically like what the minimum heat codes are for various cities across the state. And there are kind of contact numbers and information there that also can be may be helpful for figuring out who you can contact if you've got other, maybe even non-heat related questions. So that's that second link there. All right, so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our Minneapolis contingent. We have Enrique Velazquez and Brian Starry. So without further ado, please take over.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm Enrique Velazquez, the Director of Inspection Services with the City of Minneapolis. And to my right is Brian Starry, Field Operations Manager with Housing Inspections and Strategic Inspections. As we go through the presentation, we'll cover a bit of where we started to how we came into existence, how we got to where we are now, and all the different steps along our journey, and what our overall housing profile looks like, and some of the more nuanced elements of how we do inspections. So that'll be very interesting to see that dichotomy between how Minneapolis does it versus St. Paul. Anything else you want to add, Brian?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. All right. So in general terms, for our housing inventory, as we sit right now, we have a rental housing inventory of greater than 50,000 rental licenses. Just looking back just a few years to 2019, we had about 24,000. So just in a few years, we've more than doubled the number of rental licenses that we have within our, I'll call it a portfolio, or within our inventory. We've seen a number of different properties come online that are more investment focused, investment driven, not so much focused on affordable housing or quality housing, more of revenue generation. We see that especially as we progress through the pandemic, and we saw some different changes and some attrition with respect to housing on that front. More than 100,000 rental units as of February. So again, more than doubling what we had just a few years ago. Almost half of our properties are over 60 years old and built between 1812 and 1960. So what that means is we have a number of different risks that we are evaluating for, from lead mitigation and abatement to crumbling infrastructure, foundations, and other elements that we need to somehow bring current into the code, or make sure that we are managing, and make sure that property owners are aware of all the different risks and what their responsibilities are. Good. All right. Regulatory services in general, we consist of 4 divisions: animal care and control, inspection services, traffic control, and then operations and engagement. Operations and engagement is a bit of a newer division within the last few years, and they're focused more on, well, of course, the engagement aspect, but how do we engage with community? How do we show up with community? And how do we get that community feedback into the mechanism so that we can make sure that we are taking community input into consideration when it comes to mold or lead, or even just communicating with both property owners as well as renters on what their respective responsibilities are and what those renters' rights are. Inspection services is a bit nuanced by itself. Previously, we had housing inspections and fire inspections, two different aspects of the same coin, and we merged them together into one continuum where housing inspections focuses on single family, duplex, triplex rental properties. Fire inspections picks up at the fourplexes and above for rental licensing, and then goes into commercial and a host of other areas where they focus on fire code. We have in housing the housing maintenance code, and fire code is a little bit different, where there are some additional life safety requirements embedded there. So this collective inspection services takes care of that entire continuum for rental properties. Next slide. So housing maintenance code and rental licensing. In 1960, that's when we were chartered with establishing the minimum housing standards and then putting together, at that point, an enforcement program. At that time, it was primarily complaint-based enforcement, meaning we weren't proactively going out and doing inspections or checking on the quality of the rental stock, if you will, or making sure that a minimum code was reflected in each rental unit. It was purely complaint-based. And as we know, around the city and around the metro area, not every place is created equal. Not all residents complain equally. So we saw that there was this imbalance where certain communities were just okay and they accepted living with certain conditions, not knowing that they had options, not knowing the process or the systems or mechanisms in place to submit complaints, or just accustomed to living with less. Whereas other communities are a bit more vocal and make sure that they have their voices heard and that their rights are protected. So seeing that dichotomy and that imbalance, in 1991, we adopted the rental license ordinance and standards, and that's the point where we started doing proactive inspections. And then we've seen some iterations and some evolution over the course of that time from 1991 to present. Maybe Ryan, you can talk a little bit about the tiering and where we are now.
So we have established a tiering inspections here in the city of Minneapolis. So we have a tier 1, a tier 2, and a tier 3, which I think we'll get into some slide features here in the upcoming presentation. But ultimately, we felt that there was a need, or we identified that there was a need to treat some of the properties that were drawing more city resources on a continuum, that going into those proactively on our traditional cycles wasn't sufficient. And so we increased the volume and the times that we're going out to a tier 3 property. Those are inspected on an annual basis. Tier 2s are inspected on a 5-year cycle, and then our tier 1s are inspected every 8 years.
All right, thank you, Brian. Yeah, housing maintenance code. There's some basic areas that we are looking for with respect to the housing maintenance code. And these different minimum standards, we evaluate them as part of the tiering process. We look at life safety systems and making sure that those are consistent, that they're in place, that they function, and that they are consistent throughout the entire domicile or the dwellings, whatever is the rentable space. We look at nuisance complaints, exterior nuisances, look at the number of times that we have to trigger a service request. So basically, when we go out for a nuisance inspection, how many times does the property owner take care of that nuisance versus how many times does the city have to intervene and either take care of that issue themselves or hire a contractor to do that work on behalf of that property owner or property management company. Health and habitability, do we see infestation of rodents, pests, and other nuisances within the space? occupancy. Is it occupant? Is it occupied? Is it vacant? Who is occupying those spaces? And then evaluating what are our enforcement powers and procedures to be able to affect change for the betterment of the residents in that space, but then also the community around them, as this becomes a livability concern. Because the main areas that we're focused on are public safety, public health, and then general livability. So those are the three concentric circles that all converge together that we focus our work on to make sure that our minimum housing code, minimum housing maintenance code rather, is preserved, respected, and ultimately complied with. We're not out to be overly prescriptive in terms of enforcement. We're just out to make sure that property owners and residents are educated on what their rights and responsibilities are and how to regain compliance and staying on top of them so that they're accountable and the general public is holding us accountable to ensure that those codes are observed and respected. Inspections. So we have a few different tiers of inspections that we engage in. I touched on a little bit on the complaint-based inspections. We still do that. The way we have structured over the past year is we have level 1 licensed inspectors who basically handle those complaints. Our complaint management system is Minneapolis 311. So if a resident or community member contacts 311 through the webpage, through the 311 app, or by dialing 612-673-3000, they will get a 311 agent and they can file a complaint on the specific property or whatever the nuisance is. Those level 1 housing inspectors will go out and investigate the complaint. They'll do some research. They'll evaluate whether there's a rental license at that property. And if there is a rental license and it's due for inspection, that gets passed over to our level 2 license inspector or our lead license inspector. And those level 2 and lead license inspectors, they're the ones who are doing the proactive inspections. That's the tier 1, the tier 2, and tier 3 inspections that take place for those different properties to ensure that the minimum housing code is observed, it's being met, and that the property owners are taking the appropriate courses of action to resolve whatever those issues are. And then there's the license inspection, so licenses in review. That's where we might have a change in ownership or even a conversion where there's a property that was an owner-occupied dwelling that is switching over to a renter-occupied dwelling unit. And with that change from owner-occupied to renter-occupied, the requirements change because there are some additional life safety systems and other mechanisms that need to be implemented and added to that property to make sure that minimum livability and life safety protocols are in place so that those residents are living in a habitable and safe environment. All right. Then here, I'll switch it over to you for the proactive inspections.
Yeah, so the proactive inspections we do through, and what you're looking at there is a variety of just triaging nuisance complaints and things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. But our proactive inspections include what we call sweeping or canvassing of geographical areas of the city, looking for these types of environments. Right now with the snow melting, we had a long winter this year. And so as we move into spring, finally, hopefully it looks like outside anyway, we get to see what all that snow was hiding for the past several months. And so we try to remain proactive in moving those things forward. So we're not looking at what you see in the photos here for a prolonged period of time, but rather try to get those things situated and resolved. So we have the livability issues not being impacted through the visuals that you see there. And so Enrique talked about 311. So 311 are our partners. We work very closely with them. The managers, we are divided up. We have the city divided into thirds. So there's two other individuals who hold the same title as I do. And so we each have roughly about 10 to 12 inspectors who will be receiving those complaints. And then we, on a daily basis, usually every morning, and we check it several times throughout the day, just looking at the nature of the complaints and the types. And then if there's any livability or highly, I guess, sensitive complaints that are coming in that are impacting tenants directly through livability issues, we try to make sure that we're coordinating with the inspectors involved to ensure that we're taking care of those and prioritizing our workloads properly every day. And the tiering licensing inspections we talked a little bit about, but that's our tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 system that we have in place here. And then the complaint response is what we get and receive through 311. So just to give you a brief on the rental licensing tiering, the majority of our residential properties are tier 1, and they're on an 8-year cycle. They use very few city services. They're generally and overall well-maintained and properly managed, and they meet the minimum housing maintenance code. Then we move down to the tier 2, which is in our 5-year cycle, and they use a little more of our city services, maintained to a minimum housing code, but may be at higher risk for fire damage or other risk assessments based on the history of code violations that were issued. And then we get back into there's several things that will impact your tiering. One of those Enrique mentioned earlier on is nuisance abatement. So if we have to continually go out and cut your grass, shovel your sidewalk, do those types of standard maintenance things for you, which leads us to authorize those and have our contractors involved, that's usually when you're seeing the adjustment in the tiers based on that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I can add that the decision to designate a property as tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3, it's not arbitrary. It's not a gut check type of a situation where we look at it or look at the property owner and say, this feels like a tier 1 versus a tier 3. There is a grading rubric that is public facing. It's easy to understand, and it shows to the general public. It shows to property owners and aspiring property owners, as well as internal staff. Here are all the different criteria that we evaluate as part of your tiering and your rental license process. One half is about the property itself. The second half might feel a little uncomfortable, but it's about the property owner and the property management. How effectively are they managing the property? How often are they getting cited for different violations? Are they frequently delinquent or late on getting their rental license? Do they have a number of assessments attributed to them because of, as Brian already mentioned, because the city had to take on services and eventually assess the property for these different types of nuisance abatement activities? So all these different things get calculated to come together with not only the tier, but also the cost for that service to be delivered. So there is a cost for a tier 3 that's above and beyond what somebody would expect for a tier 2 or a tier 1 license. And then you can see here all the different elements that go into tiering for at least for 2023. And we do make some adjustments as we go along, as we see that we're refining the process and we continue to evolve it as we get better at reviewing the data and reviewing those high-risk situations that we might encounter. So snow and ice removal, high-risk violations, delinquent rental license fees, and on and on. Short-term rental hosting, that's kind of a newer addition to the process since we went through an ordinance change in 2019 to 2020. I apologize, the pandemic was a bit of a blur, so it all kind of blends into one year. But we made some changes there to restrict the number of rental hosting, short-term rental hosting opportunities for property owners. So we are trying to incorporate that into this process as well, so that if somebody holds a long-term rental license, they could also hold a short-term rental license, but they do need to hold that short-term rental license and abide by the housing maintenance code. Next slide.
Yeah, so we have over in the inspections division, we have a multitude of enforcement tools that we have. And ultimately, those are authorizations. We can issue extensions. So if we're working with property owners and let's just say that they had 10 code violations that were identified upon the initial inspection and they fixed, 7 of them, and they're working in good faith with us to come into compliance, we're happy to work with our property owners to make exceptions and extend those orders out to allow them a reasonable amount of time to get the necessary repairs done, with the understanding and knowing, especially just coming out of COVID, a lot of things were delayed. There were issues with getting supplies and equipment, window siding, roofing materials, things of that nature. And so when those issues were brought to our attention, we tried to be as accommodating as possible in working with our property owners on those things. And then we have citations. So if we are running into issues where we are getting no compliance, we have the ability to issue monetary citations for the unabated code violations that are in existence. Those start out at $200 or $250, depending on the violation type. And then they double after each reinspection and occurrence, that those things go unabated all the way up to $2,000 per incident. So that can get rather expensive in a short period of time. Then we have another alternative enforcement strategy, which is our TRA, ETRA situations, where TRA stand for tenant remedy action, and then the other one is emergency tenants remedy action. And so what those two things are basically is we if we're not getting compliance for a prolonged period of time, we can take court action and bring this in front of our court system and have a hearing with an actual judge, and they make the determination on what next steps are. And ultimately, if they coincide with the tenant remedy action, and the landlord's not taking care of livability or life safety issues in a timely fashion, we can implement a third-party contractor to come in and take over that property to make those repairs. And that gets into a whole other realm of legalities. And then we have rental repair revolving fund, which the one case that I'm aware of is we had a larger apartment complex. The heating source went out in the middle of winter. The owner didn't have the financial wherewithal to make the necessary repairs. And so we activated that repair group and hired a contractor to come into that property to make those repairs and get a new furnace established without having to disrupt all of the occupants who were occupying that structure. And then we have conditions, which are basically, it's a mutual agreement with our property owners or managers. If we have a prolonged history of bad things happening at a property, police activity, illegal activity, drug activity, gun violence, things of that nature, we can pull a property owner in to sit down and have just a conversation on and share the history and the things that have been occurring at the property and the problems that they're creating for the neighborhood. And then we put in place conditions that would ultimately, failure to comply or move forward with change of behavior there would potentially lead to rental license revocation. And then we get into the criminal charges, misdemeanors for non-compliance. So if the citation process is exhausted, we do have an alternative where we work with our city attorney to then go and file criminal charges for the lack of compliance, depending on the situation. And then obviously the next step is revocation or revoking of the rental license. Ultimately, that goes for, if you have your rental license revoked in the city of Minneapolis, it is for 5 years. And then prior to being able to get your rental license reestablished, you would need to have a full rental licensing inspection and be completely code compliant prior to going in front of city council to get your rental license reinstated. And then we have our navigation teams, our liaison teams, Homeline, they work closely with, as well as the other inspectors. I know we just actually had to ask for more Homeline cards because we ran out, because it is part of our just the business strategies that we have. We do share that communication with tenants who are having unresolvable issues with the property owners. And so the navigation team allows the inspectors to step out of that space and allow the liaison teams to come in and approach it from a different perspective, a non-regulatory perspective, to just have conversations and to try to resolve issues that are occurring, and to try to get any resources that are available to not only the tenants, but also to the property owners as well, just to get and gain compliance. All right, and then we have a great rental property owner training that we do. We call it RPOW. That is available, and the sessions are online through the City of Minneapolis's webpage. We actually had a session today. They last about 3 hours. It's a lot of great information, especially for new property owners or new landlords that have come into this line of business. It goes over kind of what we look for when we're doing our inspections. It explains the tiering process. The liaison team comes in and kind of talks about what they do. The health department talks about lead abatement and mold and other things. And so it's a really great opportunity to step into a space and just learn more about the rental licensing program that is established in the city of Minneapolis. And then I believe that by attending that class, you also get some discounts on your rental license and things like that. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody on that front. We've had really good success with that. All right, you want to take this one, sir?
You bet. Yeah, so from an education and proactive engagement perspective, we are in the midst of starting, so kind of odd, but we are launching our Renters First campaign, where we kind of soft launched it towards the end of the year this past year. Now we're getting a bit more involved in that space by sharing through a number of different forums, the Renter Property Advisory Council, the Housing Advisory Committee, neighborhood associations, business associations, and trying to get connected with tenant groups and engaging in a variety of different forums and methods so that we can get the information to where it's needed most with the individual renters, getting it to them in a culturally responsive way so that they understand what we are trying to do and ensure that they know what their rights are, what is their responsibility versus what isn't. Same thing with property owners, making sure that they're aware of where their responsibility starts and stops and what they are required to do just by owning property that they are planning on using for rental purposes. And for some additional information, our website is newly revamped and revised. It's kind of broken up. We used to have just a pure regulatory services web page designated to us, which doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the individual aspects of our work. So it's been kind of distributed so that now if you go under residential services, you have different options within there to navigate towards property and housing. and then you have a whole suite of information. This is just a small snapshot of what's available there about your property scoring, homesteading, and some of those other elements of rental property from both the property owner perspective as well as the renter perspective, so that each side knows what their respective rights and responsibilities are.
And they can pay their rental license now.
That's right.
Yeah.
People can pay their rental licenses now. So now you don't necessarily have to come into the public service building and sneaker net a check into us, especially if you're running late on it. You can, property owners can now log into the website here and make that payment from the comfort of anywhere around the world. All right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a lot of information. We're getting a lot of questions coming in, and I think I'm going to save those for the end, some because they'll be good, I think, for both Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so I'm going to then turn it over to AJ, who can walk us through what St. Paul does and doesn't do, I guess, as well. So, AJ, you still with us?
I am. Thank you.
Perfect. So I'm going to now turn it over to you. So let me know if you need anything. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Barry, at counterparts over in Minneapolis. They covered a lot of the stuff already. There's a lot of the similarities that we have when it comes to our tools and enforcement and so forth. So I'll hit on some of the highlights of St. Paul. I see there's a lot of questions that are coming in and a lot of pre-answered questions. So I will try and be brief, but I'll touch on exactly how St. Paul does their inspections. And like Minneapolis, they have a tier system. We have a grading system as well for our rentals. So kind of the way that it works here, the Department of Safety Inspections, Angie Weesey, she is our director. David Hoban, he is the deputy director of inspections. He covers code enforcement, construction services, as well as the fire safety unit, which is what I'm responsible for. So just to give you a review of our overview program, our fire safety unit, we were established in 1915. Back we were under the fire department previously. And then we merged into the Department of Safety and Inspections back in 2008 when it was reorganized. We switched out of that unit and we became the Fire Safety Inspection Division. Where that highlight is important is that's when our unit, much like Minneapolis and St. Paul, our fire inspectors, previously we only inspected 3 or more rental units in all commercial buildings. But that change effectively happened when we were also now responsible and charged with inspecting all non-owner occupied 1 and 2 family dwellings. So we're responsible for all commercial inspections. So any commercial building from an assembly, business, restaurant, mercantile, we do all of those inspections as well, in addition to our residential inspections. So our residential inspections are a little unique in the fact that we don't call it a rental license inspection. We call it the fire certificate of occupancy inspection. And the reason for that is we inspect all non-owner occupied properties. So the non-owner occupied properties is anything that the owner does not reside in. So even if it's a family member, so for example, if a mother, father purchases the home for their child who's a student, that building is still subject to inspection. It is not considered a rental in a lot of people's eyes, but we consider that non-owner occupied. So that would be part of the program. Go to the next slide. So our primary enforcement tools that we use is Chapter 40 of our St. Paul Legislative Code, which is our fire certificate of occupancy. We also use the Minnesota State Fire Code. And we also are responsible for enforcing the property maintenance code as well on rental properties. And that's chapter 34 of our ordinance. One of the key takeaways on that, and I noticed Minneapolis mentioned it a couple of times, is they refer to the term minimum standards. And that's a very important distinction when we're talking about enforcement, because our codes that we have, as we refer to them, are called mini max codes. And what that means is the minimum is the maximum we can enforce. So we're making sure that the property meets just those basic requirements. We can't enforce anything greater than that. I saw that there was a couple questions in the chat about smoke alarms and so forth about inspecting. The answer to that is yes. We do require smoke and seal alarms. We do inspect for those as well. The big difference in those is certain buildings based on year is going to determine where they're required. So for example, some buildings that are new, they'll be inside the bedrooms. Some older buildings, you're going to see them maybe just outside the hallway of the bedrooms. We also do nuisance abatement as well as nuisance dwellings. So anytime we have a building where they might have tall grass and weeds, junk vehicles in the yard, all the way to potential criminal activity. Those are things that we do have the ability to try and resolve. We do that in partnership with the police department and our city attorney's office. So right now, our current building inventory, we've got about 13,000 1 and 2 family dwellings, which equates to about 70,000 rental units, or fire CFO units, I should say, within our city. We have about 4,500 commercial buildings and 3,500 multi-unit buildings, as well as several mixed residential buildings. Those buildings typically you'll see a business below and 1 or 2 residential units on top. Currently, we average about 22,000 scheduled or routine inspections every year. The way our inspection program works is we're on a grading system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we do about 70 code compliance inspections. Those are buildings that were currently vacant, and they're coming off of that list, getting rehabbed and reoccupied. We respond on average to about 8,000 complaints annually. These complaints range anywhere from no heat all the way to their fire alarm or something that's an imminent life safety hazard that affects the actual habitability of the units. So we respond to a lot of complaints every year. In addition to that, we get about 700 calls or requests for service from firefighters. For example, they could have been on a medical call, or they were at a fire alarm sounding and they find a violation or an issue. They send us an inspection request to go take a look at the property as well. So this was my last slide. Like I said, I'm going to be brief, but I do want to talk about our grading system a little bit. So we have what's an A, B, and a C tier grading system. Again, just like Minneapolis, our grading system is not arbitrary. It's based on a points system. And the way that works is a Class A building, those buildings get inspected on a frequency of every 6 years. So we're in the buildings doing routine inspections once every 6 years in those. Then we have our Class B grade. Those get inspected every 4 years. They require some city services, but not much. Then we have our Class C building. Those are done every 2 years. So we're in those every other year. And then our buildings that require a lot of attention, those are our a Class D building. And those are inspected every year. With those buildings, the frequency can change. So if, for example, on a routine inspection, if a Class D building on the next routine cycle, checks through with the clean bill of health. Everything looks great. They can bump and improve their grade. And same thing, if you've got a really good grade, but you're letting your building deteriorate, you can lose that grade as well. So it really incentivizes our owners to want to maintain their properties. One, they're only paying the fee every 6 years versus every year. So there's an incentive there. Plus, a lot of them like the bragging rights too of just saying, hey, we're a Class A building. Now, the other issue with that is as well is they can lose their grade if they get multiple complaints for any number of reasons. So if a building starts to go into disrepair, and even if they were just graded a 6-year, they could have essentially lose that grade, and we could pull an early certificate of occupancy on them, which would require them to be inspected immediately and have their grade reassessed as well. Since we're only going until 3 o'clock, I'll reserve back my time for any questions for the audience.
Thank you very much, AJ. And I want to direct people also to the chat. I've been trying to put in relevant links and things like that as we've been chatting. I apologize. I absolutely was sending those links initially to just the panelists. So that's why everyone else got a whole slew of links all at once. So apologize for info dumping on everybody. But yes, this is the time for all of your questions. I see that there's several coming through in the Q&A. I'm going to start with the ones that were pre-submitted. To the perk of pre-submitting your questions, if you have them, is that we try and hit them first. Some of these are going to be, I'm going to direct to everybody, both AJ, Enrique, and Brian. You can, I guess, rock, paper, scissors amongst yourselves as who's going to answer all those. And some of them are probably going to be more in Samuel's wheelhouse. So I will try and say who I'm going to be directing this question to. So first and foremost, okay, so this is the first one is from Jennifer. They're a service provider, it looks like, and they're wondering if mental health education is a requirement for city inspectors, and what can be done if issues arise during an inspection. So I'm going to put that to both Enrique, AJ, Brian.
Mental health is, and Enrique and I were at a national conference in Atlanta, and one of the presentations that was done was specifically to mental health. And I think, mental health is a really tough issue in and of itself. And usually when we see those types of issues, like if we're talking about, excessive storage or hoarder type situations, we do try to acknowledge the fact that, yes, we're understanding that there's some mental health issues going on beyond the code violations or the issues at the property. And so we do tap into the resources that are available to us, child protection, adult protection. We have our liaison team that we spoke of, and they work with homeowners and try to get them in touch with resources that are available to them in order to resolve those types of issues. So yeah, that is a really great question, and it's something that we really try to do our best to serve the needs of everyone that we come into contact with. And so we do step into those spaces and make sure that we're getting people in touch with the resources that they need.
Right. And then just to kind of append that a little bit, mental health education isn't necessarily a requirement, however, we do provide additional training opportunities as they come available or as we're able to schedule them on de-escalation management or identifying situations and individuals who might be going through mental health challenges. So we're trying to build that awareness within our staff so that they can recognize those situations, that they do have the tools and the capacity to engage with our liaisons or crime prevention specialists or behavioral health or whatever those different avenues and resources we have available, both at the city level as well as at the county.
AJ?
Yes,
Mhm.
I do have on that. So we oftentimes work with our partners. Is formal training a requirement? No. However, we do have, as part of continuing education and a lot of the seminars and all that we go to, we do have a component of that. There's no certification or anything that we require. We do work closely with lots of resources. For like example, in Ramsey County, we have Ramsey County has a program called House Calls. So if we have a resident that may be experiencing challenges with their home, say such as like heavy content, we can provide them through Ramsey County with some health resources, how to cope with that, in addition to possibly even getting them a dumpster or a way to declutter their homes. We also work closely with our police department, with our Coast team, and DSI also has a heart team. So we'll work with our residents if they're in potential fear of displacement due to a mental health issue. We work with those units to find alternate ways to see that we can help them stay in their homes.
Yes, thank you. Next question is from Andrea. They're a tenant, and this is for the inspection teams. You kind of covered this already, I think, a little bit, but specifically they're wondering, are all rental units created equal when it comes to city inspections, or are there different rules for private versus public landlords? Let's start with St. Paul this time
Yeah.
around.
So that's always a very commonly asked question. And our property maintenance codes, our fire codes, everything that is applied through all buildings, even owner occupied homes. The difference is obviously they're not getting inspected through a rental licensure or a fire CFO program like Minneapolis and St. Paul has. However, all buildings are subject to comply with the minimum property maintenance standards, at least within St. Paul. Are all inspections created equally? Yes. As I said or alluded to earlier, we do enforce to the minimum standard for all properties. So yes, of course, you may have some buildings that are in excellent shape and they might be right next door to a building that looks minimally code compliant. As long as those buildings meet that minimum standard, we do consider that a passing grade.
Anything
and
different over in
within,
Minneapolis?
no, I was going to say within Minneapolis, it's consistent with what you'll find in St. Paul, that the minimum housing standard applies across the board, whether it's owner occupied, whether it's publicly owned or privately held properties, it applies equally. We'll also get the question of what about housing that is kind of mixed residential, where you might have market rate and you might have Section 8 housing vouchers or others. Yep, the same standard applies equally across the board, regardless of how that rent is paid or who's paying that rent. We do not create situations where, and we don't allow, frankly, situations where there's this imbalance in terms of how renters are treated.
Perfect. All right, Samuel, I think this next one is probably for you. Christy is a service provider, and they're wondering if a broken oven can be considered an emergency if the stovetop works, but the oven doesn't, or vice versa.
Sure. Well, I would say that it's in a gray area. It's not one of the specifically listed things in the statute, but it could fit under other essential services. With an emergency repair, probably the reason you care is because you're trying to file something like an emergency tenant remedies action, which gets you into court much faster than, say, a rent escrow. ETRA might get you in the court within a day or two, or probably a week at most. So it's a lot faster than the rent escrow process, which takes around 2 weeks to a month. And it matters for that reason. And that's also a little bit about how I think about it is, could the tenant go without the thing? If it's not one of the specifically listed ones, could the tenant go without the thing, whether it's the stove or the oven, for roughly a month? And that's why I think it does matter. For example, when I was 20 and never cooked in the stove, or never used the stove itself, or I should say the oven, never used the oven, it would have been very difficult for me to argue that a broken oven was an emergency repair when it had essentially no effect on my life. However, if I was someone who needed the oven, used the oven daily, maybe you have a large family or something like that, and the loss of the oven causes a much higher food bill because you have got to, change a bunch of things that you cook, or, same for the stove, then maybe you have a claim that it's an emergency repair. I can't think of any medicine that uses either the oven or the stove, but it comes up a lot with refrigeration. If you have medicine that uses refrigeration, then loss of that pretty much automatically qualifies it as an emergency. So again, I would say for this, since it's not one of the specifically listed issues, at least at the moment, it really comes down to how does it affect the tenant, and can the tenant say truthfully that it really does matter to them, and they can't really be, it's unreasonable for them to wait a month to go through the rent escrow process.
I'm shocked that you didn't make an occasional frozen pizza
Yeah,
when
no,
you were
I
20.
didn't.
Wow, good for you. I survived on those things in college. Um, okay, thank you, Samuel. Trish wants to know, their service provider, who do renters contact to get an inspection outside of their own property management company? Obviously, that's where you all come in at the city level. That's where, so I've submitted the how you can report incidents in your, if you're in Minneapolis or St. Paul, into the chat. I can put those in again. And as I said at kind of the top of the presentation, if you're not in Minneapolis or St. Paul, then it's best to contact your city to see what programs they have in place. So I think this one is probably Samuel again. Elizabeth is an attorney, and they're wondering what the options are for folks who don't have a city inspector. What happens then?
You can still file either a rent escrow or the emergency tenant remedies action. There's also the tenant remedies action, but that's a little bit more complicated. But you do so by, in the rent escrow case, sending a written repair request. And for the ETRA, you can pretty much give the notice any way that you want under the statute. Written repair requests can be in writing, that's obvious, I guess, by mail, handwritten, delivered directly to the person, email, online portal works. Texts are sort of a iffy gray area. Some courts are starting to allow them, especially if that's how the landlord and tenant communicate. But basically, the tenant would ask for the repairs in writing, wait 2 weeks, and then file a rent escrow. Again, a little bit of an oversimplification there, but that's the basics. For some things, even if there might not be a city inspector, at least every city that I've looked it up on, I don't want to say this for every place in Minnesota, but they've still probably got some building codes. And so even without a city inspector, you might just be able to point to a building code. Again, sometimes this maybe requires too much of an expert opinion for a person, a tenant, or their attorney to do, but often it doesn't. I mean, if the building code is specific enough, you might just be able to say, look, there's not enough exits from this bedroom in the basement or something like that.
All right. And I guess I want to open that up to the city inspectors as well, as if you have any suggestions. I know, obviously Minneapolis and St. Paul have their own city inspection units, but what if folks, if is it worthwhile just calling up the city to say, hey, there's a hole in my roof. Can someone come and do something about this rental?
Yeah, that's that. I mean, I guess I would say, it's dependent on the size of the municipality as well. And if, you're living in a fairly large municipality that doesn't have a rental licensing program, I mean, then I think that's an opportunity for people to get together and have that conversation to see if something can be implemented and put in place to regulate these types of issues. I know I'm from Austin, Minnesota, and I don't believe growing up, and I haven't been back for a while. I've never thought to ask anyone that works in local government down there, but I just feel like with the work that we do and seeing what I see in the lives that we've saved through the proactive work that we do on a daily basis, we're doing the public an injustice by not having some sort of a program in place for people who are renting properties, period.
Thanks for that. And actually for all y'all as well, Jennifer asks, they're a service provider, but we got kind of this same question in various flavors in the Q&A and in other respects. They're just wondering, is there a way for tenants to verify the status of rental inspections on a unit prior to entering into a lease?
So
Go ahead.
yeah, great question. I think it's dependent, on the building type. I know for us specifically, if we're doing inspections and it's a non-single family dwelling, so let's just say it's a duplex or a triplex, we try to identify the code violations specifically, unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, or upper lower unit, or however the configuration of the building is designed, just to make sure that people are aware of that. But yes, any code violations that have been issued at a property are public. It's public documentation, public information, and they do have the availability to look. And I strongly recommend that they do that.
I was going to say the exact same thing. If you go to our website, stpaul.gov, go to our website, there is a property lookup tab. You can actually look up previous inspection reports, even if there's any building permits or dog licenses or you name it that's on the property, it's there. The only caveat to that is if it is a owner occupied duplex, that it does not require a fire CFO. So you may not have any reports or documentation on that.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Is that the same as the certificate of occupancy map, AJ?
That's one of the links to that, yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, here's the, so I'm trying to make sure that I get all of these info into our chat for folks. Actually, while I'm doing that, I'm going to go to kind of the next question. Lisa is wondering about properties that are boarded up but are still occupied and lived in. What's the best course of action for addressing those issues? Like,
Great.
so it's for non-renters, but there are issues obviously in
That's a
potential
great
rental
question in a very serious situation. And obviously, the referral of the property owner that's mentioned in that question, that did take place in Minneapolis. And so it brings us into a very particular situation of the buildings, when they're condemned, they cannot be occupied. And when we have trespassing going on, it kind of adds another additional level of issues and how to move forward with those legally, usually with law enforcement and with the city attorney's office, just to make sure that we're doing everything above board and properly. But I'll let Enrique kind of finish off on that one with his thoughts.
Sure, yeah. And then also working with the property owner to make sure that they're doing everything possible to ensure that that property remains vacant, remains closed to trespass. So that means they need to provide security when whatever guise that takes, whatever form that takes, whether it's security cameras, whether it's frequent and repetitive visits to ensure that the property stays vacant, or if it's even hiring a security company to sit at that property and ensure that the building stays safe and not open to trespass. Those are some of the different pieces that the property owner needs to engage in. So we do take that very seriously. We have a strategic inspections group, which Brian leads, that also looks after properties that are entered into the vacant building registration program. And along with that, there are inspectors that go out on a repetitive basis to just check to ensure that the properties are secure, that they're boarded up, that they are not visibly open to trespass. And if they are, then reach out to the property owner or just move forward with that nuisance abatement. And that means law enforcement comes in, to sweep the building, and then also working with the contractor to resecure the building and close it up so that it's not open, and it's not creating a nuisance, and it's not creating either a livability, a public health risk, or a public safety risk, as we have seen in some instances where, especially in the wintertime, when these condemned properties are not supposed to have utilities turned on or enabled, people will try and find sources of heat in whatever capacity they can, including starting fires indoors. So just making sure that we are doing everything and going as far as we possibly can legally to ensure that these areas are closed up and secured.
Okay. AJ, I'm going to pass this one to you first. Janelle is wondering about what type of training do city inspectors get with respect to healthy housing? So like identifying mold, structural issues. And mold is a big hot button topic here at Homeline. We get lots of calls about it. So if you can kind of give a general idea of like what the training is for all of that, but then also specifically how your individual groups deal with mold.
Yes,
The big M word.
the M word. So right off the bat, our city inspectors, our fire safety inspectors who are assigned to the Fire CFO program, our initial training course, they get 210 hours of our basic fire inspection training course, which goes over all those ordinances, in addition to everything that we had discussed previously. And then obviously there's continuing education and so forth that we attend through various organizations like MACO, Fire Marshals Association of Minnesota, and things like that. When it comes to mold, yes, it's a very tricky question. So we do not test or inspect for mold. If we see something that is a mold-like substance that's visible on the surface, we will tell them to abate that issue. But we are not authorized to do what I would call an invasive inspection, where a lot of people want us to go in and actually test for mold, or to take a probe and stick in the wall to see what the moisture content is and things like that. That is not something that's within our scope of our Fire CFO program. But if we do see a mold-like substance that is visible, we will tell them to abate that. When it comes to structural issues, all of our inspectors are trained in basic fire construction for the fire service and things like that. So they are looking for those structural issues and so forth. Probably not the answer everyone was looking to hear on the mold, but it's the honest one.
Appreciate that. Thank you. All right, Minneapolis, over to you.
Yeah, the M word.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're kind of on the same page with St. Paul. We don't have the ability to properly identify mold on substrates, and so we really try to look at what is causing the moisture, where the moisture intrusion problems are coming that's creating the environment for the mold, or the alleged material or organic material that's growing. And so we try to look at it from a holistic approach of, is it a grading problem? Is there, are there cracks in the foundation? Is the grading around the property so that, designed so that we have positive drainage going around there? Are the downspouts present? Are they attached? Are they functioning properly? Are they plugged? Those types of things. So we look at it from that perspective to try to prevent the environment for the mold to grow. And then we also have orders to sanitize and clean those areas as well. And so that's kind of how we address it. But I know recently, in working with the health department, I think that we will be seeing some new legislation and some new ordinances being implemented to address that very issue. So stay tuned, Minneapolis.
Gotcha. All right, thank you for that. Farhio was wondering about property records. I put those links in the chat. Anna is a tenant, and I think this one's probably going to be for Samuel. They're wondering, can I get my rent returned to me if I found out my landlord hasn't had the property inspected?
So there, I think there's a couple different things. Just as a sort of general overview, in Minnesota, and this is true regardless of the city, tenants have a claim for rent abatement or refund of rent for living with repairs. Now, the amount of rent that they get back depends on how serious the repairs are, how it affected the tenant, and so on. But that was established by case law over 50 years ago and has been upheld multiple times. So in pretty much any case where there are serious repairs, the tenant has a right to at least some. And again, the key word there is some. It might be all, but it might only be a smaller portion of the total rent back for having to live with repairs. And there's also ways that a tenant can get rent abatement through doing things like filing an ETRA, the Emergency Tenant Remedies Action I mentioned earlier, or the rent escrow or the TRA as well. So that's the first part. But then the second, or to get to the actual question, which is they haven't done inspections. So part of that is, well, what would happen if they did the inspection and there were no problems at all? Maybe there's no rent abatement. Now, in this question, it said there were a lot of issues, so there should be at least some rent abatement. It would depend upon, again, what issues were present. But you also have another issue here where you have the question of rental licenses, which Minneapolis has an actual rental license. I believe in the city of St. Paul, it's referred to not as a rental license, but as the fire certificate of occupancy, which functions fairly similarly to the rental license. And these are city specific. And you get different results depending upon the city. Minneapolis, for example, has a pretty strict rental licensing requirement. The courts have routinely held that if there's no rental license, no rent is owed. The tenant might even be able to just, in fact, I shouldn't say might, it can almost always just walk out of the lease if it was rented without a rental license. And so there you have the further question of, right, what's happened? Has there been any other consequences? But again, that second part is city specific. So it would depend on what city you were in, whether there was a licensing requirement, what that licensing requirement said, and a bunch of other things that can't be answered more generally.
Yeah, it's one of the fun facts about just our state in general is that it is a city by city basis as to what is enforceable or not enforceable and how it's enforced. So it, especially for Samuel and I here at Homeline, it can get to be a fun chasing rabbits down holes to try and figure out what a particular ordinances or rules are in place at any given call. So thank you for that, Samuel.
If I could actually jump in and add to that real quick, and also tie back to the question about who do renters contact if the area doesn't have an inspector. A lot of municipalities, the smaller ones, they actually do a rental inspection, which the residents may not even know about it because they're only doing an interior based, or they're doing a non-interior inspection. They're only going through the common areas and looking at the exterior property in general. They don't go with inside the units. So their unit itself may not actually be inspected. So if they do that, it's a complaint-based system. So if they have an issue within their unit, there may be a code enforcement inspector in that municipality, but you have to call that complaint in. Just want to reemphasize that essential point.
Yeah, I agree. It's always worth contacting the city for sure to see, because even if they don't have something, like if it's a bad enough thing, there definitely have been instances where things are addressed because of pressures from the mayor or the city council or things like that. So it's not necessarily just all up, on to an inspector to rely on whether there's a city inspector or not. So excellent point, AJ. Thank you. Okay, this last one that was pre-submitted that none of y'all have seen because I got it last afternoon. And honestly, Tony, not 100% certain because the question got cut off, but it says, what happens if a landlord submits a complaint because the resident is um, hoarding is what they're using and hasn't gotten assistance and has failed to comply. So I guess, do you get complaints from landlords at all, or is there anything, AJ, you had mentioned about partnerships with like Ramsey County and Homes with Heart and things like that. How do is there anything that you do and work with landlords in these situations?
Well, first off, to be clear, I'm going to answer this in a very broad sense. Have we gotten complaints? Do we get complaints from landlords? The answer is yes. I also want to emphasize that it is not legal for us to divulge complainant information. That goes if landlord versus tenant, tenant versus landlord, etc. So if the landlord calls us in, we treat that as anonymous. So if they say the landlord called you, didn't we? We say, I'm sorry, we cannot divulge that information, but we're here for that reason. So just wanted to make that clear right off the bat. But yes, and that does happen. And then a lot of times it is getting those partnerships involved with those other agencies, knowing that they need help, especially we'll get calls from landlords if it's been a long-term tenant that they've got a good relationship with, but they know they need that extra assistance. So hopefully that answers that. Is there any other part to that I'm missing, Rachel?
No, and again, the question got cut off. So Tony, if you are still here, please feel free to drop the rest of that question into the chat if it hasn't been answered yet. Or if it's something super specific, and the tenant can call us and we can try and work through with that as well. All right, but that
One
is the
other
end of.
piece of that,
Mhm.
sorry, one other piece I'll add to that.
Yeah.
From the outside, it might be difficult to tell whether there is an actual hoarding situation at that property. So if you're not able to see it through the windows or see signs of it from the exterior, if it's a single family duplex, triplex, or even in a high occupancy dwelling unit, you may not be able to tell from the exterior. So from the city perspective, we have limited ability to go in and surveil the situation because we would be able to do an administrative warrant. However, we need justification to go before a judge and ask for that warrant. So if we don't have it, we don't have that smoking gun, if you will, it's difficult to go in there. So then the property owner would have to go through that process independently of the city to request access into that space if the resident isn't allowing them into the space. And then once they're able to demonstrate that there actually is a hoarding situation, then we can engage with Hennepin County, we can engage with other social service entities to help provide some assistance for that resident to remediate the issue and help alleviate whatever those concerns are.
All right, thank you for that. And so we have a couple minutes left, and that's the end of our pre-submitted questions. So I'll try and get through some of the Q&A ones. If you have to drop off at immediate 3, that's absolutely fine. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to pop up our tenant hotline information here quick on the screen for folks. And let's dig into it real quick. So for one of the questions, I think that just to kind of, it's a slight nuance from what we had before. If a property hasn't been inspected prior to the tenant moving in, what can the tenant do? So Samuel touched on that, can the rent be repaid a little bit? But what I want to clarify, I guess, is if the units don't have to be inspected, each time the a renter changes over or anything like that. Like your cities have a tiered system, so it's on that whatever year you're on. So, there may not have been an inspection. It sounds like, for 2 years since, whenever the tenant moved in, if they just moved in last year. So, but does there need to be an inspection in Minneapolis and St. Paul before a rental license is issued?
In Minneapolis, no. So as a new owner, if it's a new rental license, you can come down and obtain what's called the provisional rental license in the city of Minneapolis. And that remains a provisional rental license until full inspection has been conducted and the property is found to be code compliant. And then once that happens, then you get what's called an approved rental license. So the answer in Minneapolis is yes, you can get a rental license without the inspection. But as Enrique mentioned, if it's a change of ownership or if it's a new rental, we're trying to get into those properties sooner rather than later to make sure that we don't have any life safety issues occurring there. As far as the question that was being asked about the tenant moving into a situation or moving into a rental property that obviously it sounds like probably has condition issues. They would, I guess, upon moving in, they would be able to call 311, and if they're unable to, I always strongly urge the tenants to work with the landlords to resolve those issues. But if that relationship isn't going the way that they would like, or the repairs aren't being made in a timely fashion, they absolutely have the ability and the right to call 311 and get us out there to take a look at it, to identify the code violations and issue those orders.
And St. Paul is similar. I'll be very brief because there's still a lot of questions. St. Paul is similar, except we require the owner to self-certify that they've got basic facilities, openable windows, smoke alarms. But yes, we call it a provisional application as well.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. And we always recommend, if you're a tenant moving into a place, always take a look at the place before you sign any leases, just so that you know what you're getting yourself into. All right. And that actually also answered the question about if a landlord is not being responsive to like cockroach issues, is it appropriate to call the city? Y'all, how do you handle pest reports?
Yeah, so we have code violations specific to pest abatement, and then depending on if it's a single family dwelling or a multiple unit building, there's different rules and regulations that apply to each of those.
Okay. I assume similar for St. Paul?
Yep, same in regards to that.
Okay, perfect. And then this is, I think, a really great question, maybe to end us out on at this point. When a tenant complains to y'all, what's the timeline? What does that follow-up look like? Are the tenants ever contacted about the outcome after the issues have been inspected?
So I think for Minneapolis and for me personally, when I'm looking at those types of complaints coming in, and if it's tenant related, my expectation is that my staff are reaching out to that tenant to make an appointment same day or within at least the next couple of days. Just because if it's a life safety or if it's a livability issue, I want to be mindful and respectful of the people who are being impacted by those conditions. And so I want to make that a priority over, let's say, a nuisance violation or something like that that doesn't necessarily impact anyone's life safety or livability. So I want to make that a priority.
For St. Paul, it's similar. It's usually within 24 hours. Our staff must respond to the complaint. Of course, those get triaged though. If it's a complaint about a junk vehicle, or we have 3 complaints that are no heat related, we're going to take the no heat calls first, and that other one might get responded to at a later point. But we base it off of life safety. In response to does the tenant know about the outcome? That really it depends. And the reason for that is complaints are allowed to be anonymous. So a lot of times we respond to complaints, we address it, we handle it, but we don't have a person to follow back up with because we don't require them to provide that information. So I would say to anybody who wants that follow-up, be assured your information is kept confidential, and to share that with the inspector so they can get back to you if you want a response.
Perfect. Okay. some of these are a little bit big questions, like under what circumstances could rental housing be condemned? So, I'm assuming that's going to be more on a case-by-case basis, um, depending on building codes and things like that. Um, so, and then are there set timeframes for repairs to be done, or is that also on a case-by-case basis?
We have general rules of thumb that we follow. There's basic guideline and timelines established for each code violation, but it really depends. If, obviously if there's severe life safety issues to the point where the building is unsafe to be occupied in its current condition, I mean, sometimes those things will take effect immediately. We don't like to do that, but unfortunately, if someone has the potential to die in an environment that they find themselves in, I'd rather have them displaced and safe versus remaining or allowing them to continue to occupy an unsafe structure. But generally speaking, life safety related issues, we usually on an average basis or a normal condition, I would say that it's usually 72 hours. And then cosmetic things, painting of the walls or torn carpet or things of that nature that potentially don't have a life safety ramification or impact. It's usually 30 days. And then it's dependent on the weather too, obviously. If, we're looking at painting that needs to be done on the exterior of the property and we're coming into October, November, we'll usually push those orders out for, May or June
Okay.
to coordinate with the weather that we're dealing with at the time.
Fair enough. All right. Anything, AJ, that you would like to add for St. Paul?
It just, again, it depends. It can be 24 hours, it can be 30 days. Depends on the situation. And then too, like weather dependent, like you said, for example, if we get a no heat call, towards the end of this month, knowing that we're going to be in our 60s and 70s, we have to look at the whole severity of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, so I think we're just right up at 3 here. So if you are able to stick around for the last couple questions, feel free. But if you need to log off again, please, thank you. Please feel free to log off, and thank you so much for joining us today. And we'll have the recording up in a couple of days to our website. So, okay. All right, all right, we have 3 questions left. I think this one came in right away when we started, and the question is from Anonymous asking, why are there no codes for excessive heat in rental housing?
I can touch on that one, and it's the same, just as we explained before, the minimum codes. Our codes apply to owner occupied and non-owner occupied. It doesn't matter where they're at. All the standards and apply to the same. And the simple answer is air conditioning isn't a requirement. Just like you're not required to have air conditioning in your own home, it's not a requirement in some of our older homes. I know in Minneapolis, you said bulk of your properties are pre-1960. A lot of buildings just simply didn't have air conditioning. They had a boiler system, and it didn't accommodate for that.
Yep,
Fantastic.
exactly right.
Yep. All right. This last one's very, I think we've got 2 more. One of them is going to be more for Samuel, but this last one I think is a little lengthy. It says, if a landlord is reported for property with excessive criminal activity for the area, like catalytic converter thefts, trespassers, drugs, etc., what are landlords required to do to address the crime? For example, can they be required to install locks on doors that are actually functional, and they're required to install more security cameras? This was asked during Minneapolis's chunk of time, so this question is for both of y'all.
Yeah, so the long and short of it is that property owners, whether it's a commercial business or residential, they need to provide for a minimum level of security. What security means or what it looks like is dependent on a variety of different factors, what's the area, what's the nature of the business that are engaging in, what are they seeing happening out in the community? Because it will ebb and flow. In certain instances, they might need to hire private security to keep squatters from entering their residential properties and to keep those residents safe. They might need to change out their lighting, add in more lighting or security cameras to prevent theft and damage of vehicles in their parking lots. So it will depend on the situation. It's a terrible answer, but it depends on what the nature of the situation is and how they respond to address whatever the criminal activity and behavior is. But we will partner with them. We'll engage the crime prevention specialist and the police department to help
Okay,
support that effort.
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah,
Any,
just to touch base on that, I think what Brian was really alerting to is like having a SEPTED assessment done. And SEPTED is crime prevention through environmental design. Having one of those assessments completed, which could include lighting and a whole lot of other issues that they could do to improve the area around their building would be helpful in regards to that. Before they were required to start installing locks and doors and all that, that's based on city codes. So for example, if it's a multi-unit building, and they choose not to lock their front door, where it's open access, they could install a lock, that functions, but then they'd also have to put in requirements. One, make sure that it complies with the fire code, install a key box, and so forth. So there might be additional requirements that go into that as well.
okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Then Samuel, last question. Can a landlord refuse to renew a lease when the tenant asks for an inspection first and ask the landlord to correct any code problems prior to renewing the lease?
Sure. So I'm going to go back actually to
Ah,
that last question just very briefly and
please do.
say that, yeah, that it's a very common reason that tenants call our office. It's one of the most common reasons that they want to break their lease. So, from a landlord's perspective, if you care about not losing tenants, figuring out ways to provide that safety as much as is possible, because obviously landlords can't prevent crime just as a whole, but there are steps that they can take to provide that safety to tenants, to help tenants feel safer. Those are generally good things to do just from a practical thing. And then, if there are code violations, if there are things that the tenant can require the city to do, you go back to maybe the tenant can actually, if not break their lease, which is often quite difficult, but maybe they can file a rent escrow or something along those lines. But to answer this question, can a landlord refuse to renew a lease when the tenant asks for an inspection or any type of repair? Legally, no. Tenants are protected from retaliation in pretty much all forms. This includes, rent increases, notices to vacate, evictions, non-renewals, just sort of whatever it looks like, they're protected. There's also additional protections for calling for emergency services like police, fire, ambulance, that go above and beyond even the basic retaliation protections. This is not, of course, to say that it doesn't happen or that landlords don't try to do it. The strongest protection for tenants probably exists when they make an official complaint to the government. And I say official, really what I just mean is like through some type of government process. So complaining to like 311, for example, in Minneapolis, or filing a rent escrow or some type of, complaint with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights or something like that. They have the highest level of protection, but they're still protected even if it's just a written letter to the landlord or a call to the city inspector. And the one thing that tenants want to think about when they do this is how do they show that this is where the refusal to renew the lease is coming from. So you document things like making the request, you document statements made to you by the landlord, etc.
Fabulous. Well, and that clears us out. So thank you again so much, everybody. I will go ahead and let you all go, but we will be back next month with another webinar. So again, thank you very much, Enrique, Brian, AJ. It's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everybody.